All right, onwards to our episode. Everybody, Peter here. Welcome to Moonshots. We're going to be discussing a topic today that I'm super excited to learn about alongside with you. And we've talked about, sleep and exercise and supplements. Let's talk about diet today. Dr. Walter Longo, as I introduced, is really one of the world's experts in this area. Walter, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm looking forward to talking about the science and the practice of how and what and how much you should eat. Walter, normally you're at USC just down the road from me, but today you're across the Atlantic. What part of Italy are you summering in right now?
I'm actually in southern Italy in a region called Puglia.
Well, a pleasure. So let's begin. I'm super curious. Your work is the cornerstone of a lot of conversations around fasting mimicking, some of the terms we'll be talking about, the science. You've done a multitude of clinical studies here, and it really has changed the way I think about what I eat, when I eat, how much I eat. But how did you start this work? Where were you when you started thinking about dieting as part of the longevity area focus?
Yes, I actually started very early. I was a student of Roy Walford at UCLA, and he was my mentor, PhD mentor. And Roy was at the time probably the most famous person in the world for nutrition and longevity. And he was working on something called calorie restriction. And in fact, when I met Roy, he was not at UCLA. He was actually inside of this place called Biosphere 2, which was a sealed environment in Arizona. And him and another 7 people locked themselves up in that environment and stayed there for 2 years. So it was, I guess I had a major moment, let's say, a major exposure to this world. And Roy was a little bit crazy, but I think he was a real pioneer and a real dreamer. And so that was, they made a big difference on me. And then after that, I end up back to the biochemistry department working on starving bacteria and starving yeast. I think also influenced by Roy and the fact that he had been working on calorie restriction. But I went much further, and so I just say, well, what if I starve bacteria and yeast? What happens then? And since then, it was 1992, 93. That's all of it. I mean, I focused on that, let's say.
I knew Roy, and I was at the first Biosphere enclosure and then the coming out party. 2 of my friends were there, Tabor and Jane, Tabor McCallum. And I remember it was an incredible story. And just for our listeners, a group in Texas decided they were going to try and create the first experiment for a biosphere, with the thought, if we eventually go to the moon or Mars or into space, we want to be able to grow our food and create a self-contained, closed economic environmental system. And so they put, I think it was 8 people inside this enclosure, a glass enclosure. The only thing that came in was sunlight. They had fish in a pond. They had crops they had to harvest and eat. And so they had to balance it, to grow enough food for 2 years for them. And they had to balance the CO2 and the O2, and this grand experiment goes on. And the challenge was the fly in the ointment, so to speak, was the engineers didn't realize that the concrete they had used to basically build this enclosure was absorbing CO2. It was absorbing CO2, wasn't it? That was the issue. And so as you started, because the CO2 started getting absorbing out of the air, and they had 8 scientists inside this biosphere, everything is going fine. And then all of a sudden the CO2 levels are dropping and the plants are not growing as well. And all of a sudden they're on forced calorie restriction, and they reduced their caloric intake a lot, didn't they?
I mean, different members did different, right? Walford was the one, if you look at the charts, that lost the right amount of weight. I think maybe the other ones were cheating a little bit. But overall, they were probably at least 10% calorie restricted. And if you look at the data, it's a pretty impressive changes, which were then confirmed by randomized clinical trials by lots of other people. And by the way, Peter, we were at the same party then, because I was there when they came out. And I remember there's a lot of interesting characters, including Timothy Leary.
Timothy Leary was
at
there.
That party.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we're at the same exact same party, whatever that was, 40 years ago, 30 years ago.